Welcome everybody. Wishing you a good day. Ayan Maharaj ji, Swami Medhanandaji has been very kind enough to spend time with us, and we are so grateful to him. He will speak today on a very, very important topic. Interfaith harmony, is a very, very important thing. And today he will speak on Sri Ramakrishna, the prophet of harmony. And that is a very, very important topic because in Philippines also we, there is a great demand of interfaith understanding and interfaith harmony. It assumes more of importance because yesterday happened to be 11th September, and 128 years ago, Swami Vivekananda delivered the Chicago lecture, which is a symbol of interfaith harmony and internationalism. Maybe if the content of the lecture of 11 September 1893 by Swamiji would have been remembered by the humanity. The Holocaust of 11 September 2001, the destruction would not have happened. So it assumes very great importance. So it is very good that Swamiji will be speaking on the subject. Just to recollect, we started this program to make people calm and help people to be happy, and especially to cope with the stress and strain of the pandemic. And this is the 17th lecture in the series. So Swamiji has been very kind, and Swamiji is now, a senior research fellow in the education center at Mysuru, Karnataka, India. Swami Medhananda has a brilliant academic career apart from his very, very huge contribution in terms of theology and in the spiritual area. He did his he has been a Fulbright scholar, and he did his PhD in English literature from Berkeley University of California, and we are so lucky to have him. And before we start today's lecture, we would request our treasurer of Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of Philippines to speak a few words, followed by Ms. Rosana, who is the vice president of the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of Philippines. So Ms. Arlene, please speak. After Ms. Arlene and Ms. Rosana speaks, Maharajji will introduce Swami Medhanandaji. Thank you very much. Arlene, you are there? No. If Arlene is not there, Arlene, please, yes, please unmute yourself and speak.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arlene, Trevor of Manila, Philippines. Good afternoon, Swamiji, and to everybody who is listening and joining this video conference, our lecture. Thank you so much, Maharaji, for conducting this lecture. For the past 16 lectures, it's been really helpful to us as Filipino devotees, especially as I mentioned by Nirmalda, in coping the present COVID situation. Thank you also very much. This somehow really helps me understand and make me a better person as I am now. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you.
Rosana, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat, sa lahat ng mga nakikinig na mga Pilipino o Pinoy dito sa Pilipinas at saan mang sulok sa mundo. At nagpapasalamat po ako sa inyong lahat na nakikisa kayo sa pakikinig at panunood nitong video conference ukol kay Ramakrishna, ang propeta ng pagkakasundo-sundo ng mga relihiyon. Gusto ko pong batiin ang mga Katoliko na nagdiriwang ng 500 taon na Kristyanismo dito. Gayon din po ang mga kapatid nating Muslim. Assalamualaikum sa mga kapatid nating Buddhist at saka mga iba pa pong mga reliyon, mga born again. Welcome po at stay tuned and stay up to the end dahil marami po tayong matututuhan sa video conference ito. So go na po tayo. Thank you, welcome.
On the behalf of Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of the Philippines, welcome you all. We are very grateful to Swami Medhanandaji for kindly accepting our request, and I hope you will all really get something at the end of the talk. You will have something take away as home. But more importantly, whatever we learn, merely hearing is not enough. I feel we have to implement that also in life. You see, Swami Vivekananda used to say, just practice 5 ideas in your life, and if you can practice those 5, it is better than memorizing the whole library. So here what we are doing is giving you merely a prescription. All you have to do is purchase the medicine and follow the doctor and eat it also, consume it also. That what I mean is practice it. So good luck to you all, and with the hope that you will all get immense benefit out of this talk, I hand over the mic to Swami Medhanandaji Maharaj. Maharaj, please, thank you.
Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatar varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. My humble pranams to Swami Udaranandaji for kindly inviting me today, and my namaskars to everyone who is present today. Thank you, Dr. Ganguly, for the generous introduction. I wanted to focus today on one question. The question is, what makes Sri Ramakrishna such a unique incarnation? What's most unique about Sri Ramakrishna? That's the question. We get a clue from a letter written by Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna's disciple. This is in a letter from 1894 to his brother disciple Swami Ramakrishna Nandaji. So Vivekananda says, "My dear brother, that Ramakrishna Paramahamsa was God incarnate, I have not the least doubt. His life is a searchlight of infinite power thrown upon the whole mass of Indian religious thought. He was a living commentary to the Vedas and to their aim. He had lived in one life the whole cycle of the national religious existence in India. Ramakrishna Paramahamsa is the latest and the most perfect avatara, incarnation, the concentrated embodiment of knowledge, love, renunciation, catholicity, and the desire to serve mankind. So where is anyone to compare with him? He must have been born in vain who cannot appreciate him." So this is a remarkable letter, a statement made by Swami Vivekananda about what makes Sri Ramakrishna so unique as an incarnation. The gist seems to me that he thinks that of all the incarnations, Sri Ramakrishna stood for harmony. That's why I called the lecture today, Sri Ramakrishna, the prophet of harmony. And just a few years later, many people aren't aware that another great Indian yogi, Sri Aurobindo, he was very strongly influenced by both the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And he made a very similar statement about the greatness of Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Aurobindo said, this is in 1908, he said, "Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest of all of the avatars, the incarnations. For while others felt God in a single or limited aspect, Sri Ramakrishna felt God in his illimitable unity as the sum of an illimitable variety." So what both Swami Vivekananda's statement and Sri Aurobindo's statement about Sri Ramakrishna, what they have in common is that they think that what is most unique about Sri Ramakrishna is that he stood for harmony. So I wanted to discuss today, what are the 3 what are three of the main ways that Sri Ramakrishna harmonized different religious traditions and different spiritual paths? So this lecture is divided into three sections. It won't be too long. I also want to hear from you. So I'm looking forward to the question and answer session afterward. So I'll discuss three aspects of Sri Ramakrishna as the prophet of harmony. The first aspect is how he harmonized the different schools of Vedanta philosophy. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to look at is how he harmonized the different spiritual practices. And thirdly, how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world's religions, the different religions across the world, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, the other religions. So I'll take them one at a time. So first of all, how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the different philosophical schools within Vedanta? First of all, what is Vedanta? Most of us, when we hear Vedanta, we automatically think of Advaita Vedanta for different reasons. For a number of different reasons, Advaita Vedanta is the most popular school of Vedanta. But there are many other schools of Vedanta which many people don't know about. Schools like Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta, Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, Chaitanya's Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta, Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta, some Bheda Veda Vedanta. So there are many different schools of Vedanta. Most people think that Vedanta means Advaita Vedanta, but in fact there are many schools. So the first thing I wanted to discuss briefly is how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize these different schools of Vedanta? To understand this, we need a brief understanding of some of the main doctrines of the different Vedanta schools. And I'm not going into the details, I'll just explain briefly. First of all, what about Shankara's Advaita Vedanta? According to Sri Shankaracharya, from the ultimate standpoint, there is only one reality, and that reality is the non-dual, impersonal Brahman. It's called the Nirguna Brahman. Nirguna means literally without any attributes. That's the only reality. But from the empirical or relative standpoint, the personal God, Saguna Brahman, is real. This world, which is called Jagat in Sanskrit, that's also real. And each one of us, as an individual soul, we are also real. That's from the empirical standpoint, the relative standpoint. But what that means for Shankaracharya is that so long as we are ignorant of Brahman, then we pray to a personal God, then we see other people, we see this world of diversity. The moment we attain Brahma Jnana, the moment we attain knowledge of Nirguna Brahman, all of these things vanish, and what's left is Nirguna Brahman. And we realize that we are that Brahman, and that there's nothing else. So this is Shankaracharya's philosophy. According to Shankara, the ultimate reality is only Nirguna. Now, what do other schools of Vedanta say? Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta, which is, by the way, I assume many of you have read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, either in English or in another language, or Bangla. You'll find that even Sri Ramakrishna, he also talks about Ramanuja's philosophy in many places. So what is Ramanuja's understanding of the ultimate reality? According to Ramanuja, the ultimate reality, Brahman, is personal, is saguna, and not impersonal. So it's the opposite view of Shankaracharya. According to Shankara, Brahman is nirguna, but not saguna. According to Ramanuja, and according to Madhva, who is the founder of the Dvaita Vedanta school, according to Ramanuja and Madhva, Brahman is only saguna, personal, but not nirguna, not attributeless, not impersonal. So these are directly conflicting philosophies. How can we harmonize them? This was the challenge for Sri Ramakrishna. And there are more schools. So just to mention two more schools of Vedanta and what their views are about ultimate reality. The school of Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta of Chaitanya, Sri Chaitanya. And the school of Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta of Vallabhacharya. These two schools, they accept both the Nirguna Brahman and the Saguna Brahman. So they accept both the personal God and the impersonal God. However, they insist that there's a hierarchy, and that the personal God, Saguna Brahman, which they take to be Krishna, that is a greater reality than Nirguna Brahman. And they say that Nirguna Brahman is just a very minor, inferior aspect of Krishna himself. So, for instance, in Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta, these followers, these Vaishnavas, Gaudiya Vaishnavas, they refer to Nirguna Brahman as the Tanubha of Krishna himself. Tanubha means just a minor aspect of Krishna. So you can see that according to these two schools of Vedanta, Achintya Bheda Veda and Shuddhadvaita, they accept both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, but they put Saguna Brahman on a higher level. And they're saying Nirguna Brahman is a lower or somehow inferior reality. Now, how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize these different schools of Vedanta? This is the main question. What Sri Ramakrishna did is he 100% accepts the reality of Nirguna Brahman, which is taught, accepted by Shankaracharya, Advaita Vedanta. He also, unlike Shankara, he 100% accepts the ultimate reality also of Saguna Brahman, of the personal God, like Ramanuja and Madhva. And then you might ask, well, then isn't Sri Ramakrishna's view similar to Achintya Bheda Veda or Shuddhadvaita? Yes, you can say that Sri Ramakrishna's view comes closer to the views of Achintya Bheda Veda and Shuddhadvaita than to Shankaracharya or Ramanuja. Why? Because these two schools of Vedanta, Achintya Bheda Veda and Shuddhadvaita, they accept both the personal and impersonal aspects of God. So in that regard, Sri Ramakrishna's view comes closer to Achintya Bheda Veda and Shuddhadvaita. But there's still a difference. And the difference is that, remember that according to Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta and Shuddhadvaita Vedanta, the personal God is higher or superior to Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal Brahman. But according to Sri Ramakrishna, both the personal God and the impersonal Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, are on an equal footing. He gives them equal importance, he gives them equal value, he gives them equal reality. What is the evidence for this? There are many, if you just study the gospel carefully, you'll find that he says this in many different ways. He says, for instance, in Bengali, he says, Brahmo Oshakti Abhed, which means the impersonal Nirguna Brahman is the same reality as Shakti. And by Shakti, he means the personal God. And he says it even more clearly when he says, when God is actionless, I call God Brahman. When God creates, preserves, and destroys, I call God Shakti. যখন তিনি নিষ্ক্রিয় তখন আমি ব্রহ্ম বলে কই, যখন তিনি সৃষ্টি প্রলয় করছেন তখন আমি শক্তি বলে কই. So he's saying that the same divine reality can be seen from different standpoints, and both are equally valid, both equally valuable. When you think of God as creating this universe and as destroying the universe, then God is Shakti for you. But when you think of the same God as Nishkriya, as inactive and as impersonal, that same God is Brahman. And you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna does not have any kind of hierarchy. He doesn't say that the personal God is higher than the impersonal Brahman. He doesn't say that the impersonal Brahman is higher than Saguna Brahman. He puts them on an equal footing. In many places, he also would say this as follows. He would say in Bangla, Jini Nirgun Tini Shogun, which means that divine reality which is Nirguna, impersonal, is also Saguna, personal. So again and again, you'll find that he doesn't make any kind of hierarchy. Another beautiful example he gives is of a chameleon. In Bangla, a Bohurupi. He says that, imagine that there's a chameleon on a tree. And one person comes up the tree and sees that the chameleon is orange. And then he comes back to his friends and he says, I just saw an orange chameleon. Then another friend goes a few hours later and sees that chameleon, but he sees it as green. And then he comes back and tells his friend, you're wrong. It's that chameleon, I saw that chameleon. It's not orange, it's green. And then a third friend goes, he sees it as colorless. The chameleon has no color at all. And these three friends are fighting very angrily with each other. They said, no, you're wrong, you're foolish. But there's one person who knows that the chameleon has all of these colors, and sometimes is also colorless. And that is the person who sits under the tree, the person who lives under the tree. So in this example, for instance, you'll find that the colorless chameleon, you can guess that the colorless chameleon corresponds to Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal Brahman. And the different colors of the chameleon, green, orange, blue, etc., they correspond to different forms of the personal God, of Shakti. And notice that in this example, it doesn't make sense to say that the colorless chameleon is somehow more true then the orange chameleon or the green chameleon, they're all equally true. The chameleon can assume all these different forms. And it's not that one is more real or more valuable than the other. So this was Sri Ramakrishna's position, and this is how he harmonized the different schools of Vedanta. For Shankaracharya, I'll just remind you as a summing up that according to Shankara, the ultimate reality is only nirguna, impersonal. For Ramanuja and Madhva, the ultimate reality is only saguna, personal. And according to Achintya Veda Vedanta and Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta, Brahman is both nirguna and saguna, both personal and impersonal. But they put the personal God on a higher footing than the impersonal. And Sri Ramakrishna harmonizes all of these different schools of Vedanta very beautifully by saying that the same divine reality is equally nirguna and equally saguna, and both the personal God and the impersonal Brahman are equally important and equally valuable. And it's a matter simply of your own preference. One nice statement that he would often make, a beautiful teaching, is in Bangla. I'll mention first in Bangla and then I'll translate it. He said, Bhaktora chini hote chai na, chini khete chai, which means bhaktas, devotees of God, worshippers of the personal God. They don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. So the idea here is, it's a matter of preference. Some people have Advaitic leanings. They somehow have a preference based on their own samskaras and from previous births and from their spiritual practices. They like Nirguna Brahman. They want to become sugar. They want to realize their identity as the Advaitic absolute Brahman. And Sri Ramakrishna is great. They'll have that, and they can do that. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a wonderful path. But for bhaktas who don't want to become sugar, but who want to eat sugar, what does eating sugar mean? Eating sugar means they want to be in a loving relationship with the personal God. And in order to be in a loving relationship, in order to love somebody, there has to be some distance, no matter how slight, between the lover and the beloved. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna will say, for bhaktas, they don't want to become Brahman, they want to love Brahman. So they love Brahman as Krishna, as Sarguna Brahman, as Kali, as Christ, as Allah. And both are equally fine. It's just a matter of preference. So that's the first part of my lecture. How did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the different schools of Vedanta? The second aspect of Sri Ramakrishna as the prophet of harmony is how he harmonized the different spiritual practices and spiritual paths. So many of you are probably coming from a Hindu background, so many of you probably know that there are four main yogas within Hinduism. So, and especially within Vedanta. So one is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. One is Bhakti-Yoga, the path of bhakti or devotion. The third is Karma Yoga, the path of selfless works. And the fourth is Raja Yoga, the path of meditation and concentration. These are the four main yogas. And different schools of Vedanta, they tend to place one of these yogas above the other ones. So for instance, according to Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta, the highest spiritual path is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. And he says that the other paths, like Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, they're also okay, but they're not the highest. They can only take you part of the way. So through the practice of Karma Yoga, we can purify our minds. We can attain Chitta Shuddhi in Sanskrit, purification of mind. And through the practice of Bhakti Yoga, we can also purify our minds and we can also concentrate our minds. Through the practice of Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, we become adhikaris, we become eligible. We become qualified aspirants to practice the higher spiritual practice of Jnana Yoga. So it's like this. I first have to do the bachelor's degree, then the master's degree, then I can do the PhD. So in the same way, Shankaracharya says in other Advaita Vedantas, they say that Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga are like the bachelor's degree. You have to do it. But the ultimate goal is you have to do the PhD. And the PhD here is Jnana Yoga. And after you get the PhD, you get Jnana, Brahma Jnana. But through Bhakti Yoga, you cannot attain knowledge of Brahman. Through Karma Yoga, you cannot directly attain the knowledge of Brahman. Only through Jnana Yoga can you attain the knowledge of the absolute impersonal Brahman. This is Shankaracharya's philosophy. Jnana Yoga is the highest path. What about the other schools of Vedanta? I already mentioned just a few minutes ago, Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta, and Madhva-Dvaita Vedanta, Achinta Bheda Vedanta, Shuddha-Dvaita Vedanta. All of these schools are what are called Bhakti schools of Vedanta because they're based on devotion. And in fact, I would recommend a book to you if you're interested in going deeper into these issues. Swami Tapasyanandaji, who was one of our great Swamis, he was a vice president of the Ramakrishna order. He wrote a nice book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. And he gives beautiful summaries of the life and teachings of the great acharyas of the Bhakti schools. So Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Chaitanya Deva, Vallabhacharya, these other acharyas. So that's just by the way. So according to the Bhakti schools of Vedanta, the highest spiritual practice is Bhakti-Yoga, the yoga of devotion. It's natural because they're Bhakti schools, so they're going to say that Bhakti is the highest level. And they say that the other yogas are also good, but they put them on a lower footing. So almost like the opposite, the reverse of Shankara. Shankara puts Jnana Yoga on the top and says Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga are lower. Bhakti schools of Vedanta put Bhakti Yoga on top and they put Jnana Yoga on a lower level. They put Karma Yoga on a lower level, okay? So there's all of these schools of Vedanta, they have a hierarchy of spiritual practices. Some schools put Jnana Yoga on top, like Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. The Bhakti schools put Bhakti Yoga on top, right? And the other practices are lower. Now, what is Sri Ramakrishna's view? According to Sri Ramakrishna, all of these yogas are equally capable of taking you to the highest goal, which is God realization. That's the greatness of Sri Ramakrishna, is that he harmonizes different spiritual practices in a more egalitarian way, in a non-hierarchical way. He doesn't say that Bhakti is higher than Jnana or Jnana is higher than Bhakti, but he says, whatever path you like, you go on that path. And through that path, you'll reach the highest goal. And Sri Ramakrishna's disciple, Swami Vivekananda, he said the same thing. This is a direct quotation from Swamiji's, I believe it's from Raja Yoga. He says, each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect, even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, Karma Yoga, of wisdom, Jnana Yoga, and of devotion, Bhakti Yoga, are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha, liberation. Through each of these yogas, you can attain the highest goal of liberation or God realization. This was Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's wonderful teaching. So this covered the second aspect of my lecture, which is how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the different spiritual practices within Hinduism and within Vedanta, the four yogas. He said that through any of these paths, we can reach the same goal, and through a combination of any of the paths, we can attain the same goal. Third and finally, last but not least, how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world's religions? And this is especially important, I think, in light of the fact that I'm just speaking one day after September 11th. And of course, as Dr. Ganguly mentioned, September 11th, 1893 was the great speech of Swami Vivekananda in the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, teaching the harmony of all the world's religions. And unfortunately, just a few decades ago, there was also a 9/11 that will now live in infamy, September 11th, 2001, the day of the World Trade Center bombings in the US, which is, it stands for the exact opposite of what Swami Vivekananda taught, right? Which is because of religious violence and hatred, many people had to die. So on this day, I think it's especially important to try to understand with an attitude of reverence and humility how great saints like Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, how they were able to harmonize the world religions so all of us can live in peace, so that we won't fight with each other anymore. So how did he harmonize the world religions? The beauty of Sri Ramakrishna is that he was not an intellectual in the way that if you go to a university, you'll find intellectuals. They can talk all day intellectually about the harmony of religions. But what Sri Ramakrishna did was something much greater. He was a kind of scientist in the spiritual realm. And by that I mean, what does a scientist do? The scientist will not accept any claim until he or she has tested that claim, until he or she has verified the claim through an experiment, right? So a scientist will start with a hypothesis. And the scientist will say, I don't know if this is true or not. Let me test it. Let me do an experiment Based on the results of the experiment, I will decide whether to accept the hypothesis or reject the hypothesis. Exactly like this, Sri Ramakrishna, as a spiritual scientist, he actually practiced different religious traditions. So within Hinduism, he practiced different Vaishnava spiritual practices. He also practiced Tantra, and he had a Tantra guru. He also had Vaishnava gurus. He also practiced Advaita Vedanta under a different guru, Totapuri, who was an Advaita Vedantin. And he practiced them with full sincerity and with his whole heart. And he found that through the practice of all of these different Hindu paths, he reached the same goal, which was God realization. He realized that he was realizing the same God in different forms and aspects. Through the path of Advaita Vedanta, he became one with the non-dual Nirguna Brahman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Through the path of Tantra, he realized that same Brahman as the Divine Mother, as Kali, as Shakti. And through the path of Vaishnavism, he realized the same Brahman as Bhagavan Krishna and as Rama, and even he identified strongly with Hanuman during one phase of his spiritual practices. So it's he's a remarkable example of a saint who practiced many different paths. Now that's just within Hinduism, but what is even more remarkable is that he practiced non-Hindu religions as well. And I wanted to go into a bit of detail, especially because I'm speaking to people who live in the Philippines, and many of you are familiar with Christianity and Islam. I wanted to talk in some detail about Sri Ramakrishna's Islamic practice and Christian practice, and how ultimately did he harmonize Hinduism with Islam and Christianity, and show that they're all leading to the same goal of God realization. So in 1866, Sri Ramakrishna was suddenly seized with a desire to practice Islam. And the moment he had that desire, he found somebody named Govinda Rai, who was most likely a Sufi practitioner, sadhaka. And that Govinda Rai initiated him into Islamic practice. It may have been some Allah mantra, something like that. And for 3 days, Sri Ramakrishna forgot all about Kali, his beloved Kali. He forgot all about Hindu deities. He stopped going to the temple in Dakshineshwar, the Kali temple. And he was just, as if possessed, he would just repeat the name of Allah. And he would do the prayers according to Islamic practice, the namaz. He ate in the same style as the Muslims eat, everything. And then he himself says, this is a direct quotation, which I'm taking from Leela Prasanga, which is the biography of Sri Ramakrishna written by Swami Sharanandaji. So Sri Ramakrishna says, after 3 days of practice of Islam, I attained the spiritual goal of Islamic sadhana. And then he says, he first had a divine vision of a radiant being who looked grave and had a long beard. And then he realized that that vision was of the Saguna Brahman, of the personal God. And then his mind finally merged into the absolute Nirguna Brahman. So first he had this vision of the personal God, this realization of the personal God, and then his mind merged into the Nirguna Brahman. So again, through the practice of Islam, he realized a different form of the personal God, and then ultimately that form of the personal God merged into the same Nirguna Brahman that he realized during his Advaita Vedanta practice under Totapuri. And this is also mentioned in Leela Prasanga. After he practiced Islam, he had the conviction that the infinitely sportive Divine Mother, Ananta Lila Moima in Bangla, the infinitely sportive Divine Mother, the Divine Mother who loves to sport in infinite forms. This Divine Mother has revealed herself to many people through the path of Islam. So as a spiritual scientist, he verified the validity of the path of Islam and himself practiced it and realized that it takes us to the same goal as all of the other world religions. Now, what about Sri Ramakrishna's Christian practice? A few years later, in 1874, Sri Ramakrishna became interested in the path of Christianity. And some of his devotees knew quite a bit about Christianity. So one of them was Shambhu Charan Murli. So Sri Ramakrishna asked him to teach him about Christianity. So Shambhu started reading to him from the Bible. and especially focusing on the teachings of Jesus from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the synoptic gospels of the New Testament. And through that practice, Sri Ramakrishna became acquainted with the holy life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. So while he was in this state of this kind of reverential attitude of worship, thinking of Jesus Christ in a very worshipful, reverential way, he was sitting in the parlor of another devotee named Judulal Mullik. And he was staring at a picture of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus, cradling Jesus as a baby in her arms in a very loving way. And Sri Ramakrishna, while he was staring at the picture, he suddenly had a spiritual experience. And this is Swami Sharan's narration of what happened when he was looking at this picture of the baby Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Just then, Sri Ramakrishna saw the picture become animate and luminous. Rays of light emanated from the bodies of Mother Mary and child Jesus, entering the master's heart and revolutionizing his mental attitudes. When he observed that his inborn Hindu impressions were vanishing from his mind and that different ones were arising, he tried to control himself by resisting them in various ways. He entreated the Divine Mother, saying, "Mother, what are you doing to me?" But the onslaught continued. The waves of those impressions rose forcefully and completely submerged the Hindu bent of his mind. The master's love and devotion for Hindu gods and goddesses disappeared, and his heart was filled with faith in and reverence for Jesus and his religion. Sri Ramakrishna then had a vision of Christian clergymen offering incense and lights in front of the image of Jesus in a church, expressing their inner longing through prayer. So he had this remarkable spiritual vision of Jesus Christ and the beauty of the Christian religion. And then he completely remember that when he was practicing Islam, he forgot about his beloved mother. He didn't think about practicing Hinduism or praying to any other Hindu gods. In the same way, once he was seized with this reverence for Jesus, he completely forgot about Kali for that time being, for those few days. And he was, as you could tell from that quotation, he became frightened in the beginning because he asked, "Mother, what are you doing to me?" But he couldn't resist, and he became fully intoxicated with love for Jesus. And after 3 days of Christian practice, being completely absorbed spiritually in the thought of Jesus, he was standing in a garden, and suddenly he had a vision in the Panchavati, which is in Dakshineshwar, where he lived. He said, and now this is narrated by Swami Sharananji in the Leela Prashamur. He says, when Sri Ramakrishna was walking in the Panchavati at the end of the 3rd day of his Christian practice, he saw a beautiful but unfamiliar God-man with a fair complexion advancing towards him, gazing at him steadily. Sri Ramakrishna immediately realized that he was a foreigner and that he belonged to a different race. He saw that his eyes were large and beautiful, and though his nose was a little flat at the tip, it in no way marred the handsomeness of his face. The master was charmed by the unique divine expression on his serene face and wondered who he could be. Very soon after that, the figure drew near, and a voice from within told him, "This is Jesus Christ, the great yogi, the loving Son of God who is one with his Father, who shed his heart's blood and suffered torture for the salvation of humanity." Then the God-man Jesus embraced the master and merged into him. In ecstasy, the master lost external consciousness, and his mind remained united with the personal God, Saguna Brahman, for some time. With this vision, the master became convinced that Jesus was truly a divine incarnation. So this again was a very remarkable experience. Through his own direct spiritual experience, Ramakrishna realized that Jesus Christ was none other than Son of God, an avatar. And after that, he worshipped Jesus as an incarnation, and he kept a picture of Jesus in his own room and would pray to him every day. So Sri Ramakrishna is a wonderful example. These days, many people in these interfaith conferences, they talk about something called multiple religious belonging, which means that you practice not just one religion, but multiple religions. And Sri Ramakrishna was one of the first examples, shining examples of somebody who actually practice not just Hinduism, but also Christianity and Islam, and within Hinduism, multiple different religious traditions. And on the basis of all of his spiritual experiments, on the basis of his practice of Christianity and Islam and different Hindu practices, he taught again and again that all of the world religions are different paths leading to the same goal. And he said this in many different ways. He said, Joto Mot Toto Pot in Bangla, which means as many faiths, so many paths. But one of my favorite teachings is this one. He said in Bangla, Tini Ananto Potho Ananto. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. And the reason why I like this teaching is because he explains why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God himself, God herself, the Divine Mother, is infinite. So logically, if God is infinite, then there should also be infinite ways of realizing God and of seeing God, of realizing God, right? So these are the three main aspects of Sri Ramakrishna as the prophet of harmony that I wanted to discuss today. Let us all try to learn from the harmonizing and Catholic spirit of Sri Ramakrishna. And as Swami Medhanananda mentioned, it's not enough to just listen to lectures, but we should try to practice it in our own lives. So whenever we meet somebody of a different religious faith, we should not just respect them, not just tolerate them, but we should actually embrace them mentally and try to learn from other religious perspectives. And we should, if possible, try to incorporate aspects of their religious traditions into our own spiritual practice. This is something that Swami Vivekananda emphasized again and again at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. This is from one of his addresses in 1893. Swami Vivekananda, he said, I accept all religions that were in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them, in whatever form they worship him. I shall go to the mosque of the Mohammedan, the Muslim. I shall enter the Christian's church and kneel before the crucifix. I shall enter the Buddhistic temple where I shall take refuge in Buddha and in Islam. I shall go into the forest and sit down in meditation with the Hindu who is trying to see the light which enlightens the heart of everyone. Not only shall I do all these, but I shall keep my heart open for all that may come in the future. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Pranamastu.
What a beautiful discourse on interfaith harmony. I think we are so lucky to have such a beautiful discourse on interfaith harmony, and the example of Swamiji, what he talked in Chicago in 1893, and how Sri Ramakrishna practiced harmony in terms of uniting the Vedantic concepts, uniting all the religious practices. What a beautiful way Swami Medhanandaji has expressed. We are sure that it will have a lot of observation and questions. We can start with Hiranya Mukhopadhyay. So Hiranya, if you have any thoughts, please share.
There is lot of echoes. Okay. Maharaj, it's a problem. Someone's microphone is on. Maharaj, I have no.
All of us can get muted, excepting Hiranya. All of us can get muted and let Hiranya speak.
Is it? No.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll wait. Let someone
Yes.
see.
Let
I'll wait.
Anandji speak. Anandji, if you have something to observe. Anand Chiplumkar.
Yeah. Pranam Maharaj, I'm Anand calling from Pune. It was a very lucid and nicely explained concept and lecture. Sometimes what I feel is that conceptually, while this is very clear that all religions are the same, we often find that when people get to interact with each other, rather than discussing about the same goal, which both of them ultimately go to, they start discussing about the practices, some of which are also contradictory at times. Now, what's the best way of sometimes advising such persons or to speak with such persons that why different practices and contradictory practices should be tolerated and yet you will both achieve the same goal? This is a sort of a burning question which comes into many group discussions and stuff like that.
Maharaj, you are on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. It's an excellent question. And in the philosophy of religion, this is what's called the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. That's the technical name for this problem. To give you some examples, so Hinduism and Buddhism, they accept reincarnation. But Christianity, Judaism, Islam, generally the orthodox forms of these religions, they don't accept reincarnation. This is an example. There is a direct conflict. Also, did Jesus Christ die on the cross? Christianity says yes. Islam says no. They believe Jesus was a prophet, not an avatar, but a prophet. And they said he didn't die on the cross. Again, there's a conflicting doctrine. So Anand, that's a very important question. If we accept that all the religions are equally valid paths leading to the same goal, don't we end up with these kind of contradictions? How can we coherently accept the harmony of all religions? That's the question. That's the difficulty. And I can't go into the details. If you want the details, I recommend, I published a book 3 years ago. It's called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. The third chapter of this book discusses this issue in detail. So if you want a detailed and technical answer with full evidence, then I recommend that you read chapter 3 of the book. I'll give you just a very brief answer. Sri Ramakrishna, what he would say is, he gave the example of a watch, and he said, everybody thinks his own watch tells exactly the correct time. Then he says, but nobody's watch is exactly correct. Nobody's watch is perfect. This is a beautiful insight. He's comparing each person's watch to that person's religion. So Hindus will think that their Hindu watch tells the correct time and that the Islamic watch and the Christian watch and the Buddhist watches are all wrong. And Muslims will think that their watch tells only the right time and other people's watches don't tell the right time. Ramakrishna says, no religion is 100% perfect. That's the first thing to keep in mind. This is the way to, first of all, we have to cultivate humility, and we should not pretend mistakenly that our religion is perfect and that everybody else is wrong. Every religion has mistakes. Every single religion, even Hinduism, has mistakes. It makes some errors. This is what Sri Ramakrishna says. No watch tells exactly the right time. This is the way that Sri Ramakrishna puts it. But then he says, but it's a minor error. And even with those small mistakes, it's enough to get the work done, to get your job done. See, even if my watch is not perfectly synchronized with Greenwich, the mean time, it's within a few seconds, which means I can still get to work on time. I can wake up, and I can still get my work done. In the same way, Sri Ramakrishna says, in spite of the errors which are present in all of the world religions, each of those religions is still a perfectly good path to the goal of God realization. So what his main answer is this, that don't overestimate the importance of religious doctrine. All the fighting that happens throughout the world in the name of religion happens because they place more value and more importance on the different doctrines of religion than on the goal of religions, which is the realization of God and the attainment of perfect fulfillment, perfect bliss. Call it salvation, call it moksha, call it heaven, whatever you want. Different religions define the goal in different ways. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna in Bengali would say, Mot path, mot kintu kichu kono ishwar noy. He says, every religious path, every religious doctrine is a path to the same goal of God realization. But don't confuse religious doctrine for God. Doctrines in every religion are just a means to the end of God realization. So even if Christianity and Islam and Judaism are wrong about reincarnation, let's, as a kind of hypothetical example, let's say that reincarnation is true. That means Hinduism and Buddhism are correct about that, and that the Abrahamic religions are wrong. Even so, Sri Ramakrishna said it doesn't matter. In fact, in one place in the Gospel, Mohangannath Gupta, who is the writer, he is the author of the gospel. He asked Sri Ramakrishna, he says, I don't have much faith in rebirth and all this karma theory, all this stuff. Will that harm my religious practice in any way? And Sri Ramakrishna says, no, don't worry about it. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation, all these things, you can still practice perfectly. And then he said, but don't think that you alone are right and that everybody else is wrong. This is what Sri Ramakrishna would say. So I think this is the takeaway message that Sri Ramakrishna gives us, is that even though there are conflicting religious doctrines, he would say, even if some of the doctrines of every religion are wrong, each religion is still perfectly equipped to bring us to the highest goal, which is God realization. Thank you for that excellent question.
That's a very nice answer.
What
Thank you.
What a graphic resolution of the conflict. I think all of us have much to take away. Kumar, would you have something to some thoughts to share with Swamiji or some question? N.K. Kumar.
Can I check?
Kumar, unmute yourself and you can speak.
Pranam Maharaj. Namaskar, Ganguly Sahab. So it has been a revelation to listen to Maharaj's excellent exposition. And in fact, the insightful question of Anandji was also very brilliant in the sense that we could capture the essence. It takes me back to the 70s when I was a student of Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda College. And we used to hear, Swami Gambhirananda, Swami Kailashananda, and Swami Tapasyananda and all. So, in fact, I'm so much filled with nostalgia that I'm not getting myself around to really ask a question. I'm enjoying the ambience, and it's been a wonderful, journey. So, thank you so much. I'm sure that other persons may also come up with some lovely questions. Thank you once again. Namaskar.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Nirmal,
Kumar.
can I check?
Yes. Hiranya, please speak. Can you speak from Kasturi's thing or it has been resolved?
Okay. Let me try.
In the meantime, if anybody else has questions, they can ask.
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead, Nirmala. Sirish here.
Please.
So a couple of questions. You mentioned about Achintya Veda, where they actually believe in Saguna, which is higher than Nirguna. So is this similar to, again, Sri Aurobindo, who mentioned, he takes Purushottama as an aspect and places again higher to the Advaitic Nirguna experience. So does it fall into the same bracket, or is again there is a deviation in terms of philosophies?
That's a good question. So I think that, so you mentioned Purushottama. So this comes from his interpretation of chapter 15 of Bhagavad Gita. So where the concept of Purushottama comes. And according to Sri Aurobindo, Krishna, God, the ultimate reality, is the Purushottama, which is both Saguna and Nirguna, both personal and impersonal. But this is how I interpret Sri Aurobindo. And I've written a few scholarly articles about this. If you're interested, you can look at them. I have an article from 2015, which discusses Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. But I think that Sri Aurobindo actually follows Sri Ramakrishna in placing Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman on equal footing. See, Purushottama, actually, in Vaishnava traditions, like Achintya Veda, Krishna is the Purushottama. But that means that Purushottama there is Saguna Brahman, and it's higher than the Nirguna Brahman. But Sri Aurobindo does not accept that Vaishnava position. Sri Aurobindo follows Sri Ramakrishna in saying that the Purushottama is equally Nirguna and Saguna. He doesn't say that that Saguna is a higher reality than Nirguna. So basically, I think that Sri Aurobindo follows Sri Ramakrishna rather than Achintya Veda this way, in giving equal value and importance to Nirguna and Saguna Brahman. Thank you for that question.
To follow on that question, many times we read in Gospel that Sri Ramakrishna, goes to Bhavamukha. So when you say Bhavamukha, are you so is gospel referring to the Saguna experience or Nirguna experience or in between experience, which Sri Ramakrishna experiences? So in terms of experience, what's the difference between again Achintya Bheda or Dvaitic experience? So how does this experience differ from the philosophical standpoint?
That's a good question. So you mentioned Bhavamukha. One of the things that's very interesting in the spiritual literature of the Ramakrishna tradition is that if you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is over 1,000 pages, you will not find a single reference to Bhavamukha. But you will find countless references to what Sri Ramakrishna calls Vijnana. And in Leela Prasanga, the official biography of Sri Ramakrishna written by Swami Sharon, you'll find that it's full of references to Bhavamukha and not a single reference to Vijnana. It is very interesting. So to understand Sri Ramakrishna, we have to take both of these texts together. We have to study carefully the gospel, ideally in Bangla. So we should be reading Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita in Bangla. We should always read things in the original language if possible. And we should read the Leela Prasanga, the Sharadani's biography. And what we find, if we study both those texts very carefully, is that what Sri Ramakrishna calls Bhavamukha is the same thing as Vijnana. And to answer your question, what is this state of Vijnana, basically? The state of Vijnana is like, I mentioned in my lecture, Sri Ramakrishna's example of the chameleon, and that there's a chameleon on a tree. Most people will only come to the tree once in a while, and they'll see the chameleon in one color, orange, green, red, colorless. But there's one unique person who's always living under the tree, and he sees the chameleon in many colors. That person sitting under the tree 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is the Vijnani. Because that Vijnani, so the way that Sri Ramakrishna would put it is, Vijnani dekhe jini nirgun tini shogun. In Bengali, he says, the Vijnani realizes that that reality which is nirguna is also saguna. It's a spiritual experience, actually. It's not an intellectual understanding. It's a direct spiritual. So the whole idea behind Bhavamukha, even the term Bhavamukha, it means like standing at the threshold between the nirguna absolute, the absolute impersonal Brahman, and the personal God. So the way that Sri Ramakrishna would put it, he would say that he would bring in the paradigm of the Sapta Bhumi in the Vedas. There are different planes of being. And he says that the Vijnani the one who impersonal to the personal, from the personal to the impersonal. He also calls it going from the Nitya to the Leela, and from the Leela back to the Nitya. So this is a distinct and unique spiritual realization which directly harmonizes the personal and impersonal aspects of God through his own experience. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
Can I give one now answer?
Sure.
Just a follow-up question on that, Hiranyada. Sorry. So can we say, I mean, you said the observer's experience is Vijnana's experience, right? In the example of chameleon. So can we say that Advaitin has only the view of red chameleon and probably Dvaitin has only an observation of green chameleon? I mean, can we say that experience is limited rather than the horizon is limited compared to Vijnana? Can we say that? Or
yes, I think we can. Except I would say that Advaita does not correspond to the red chameleon. It corresponds to the colorless chameleon.
Oh yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Correct.
And the different colors correspond to different forms of the personal God.
Right.
Yeah. I think we can say that. Another example is the blind man and the elephant. This is the even more famous example. Sri Ramakrishna will say, there are 5 blind men. Each one is touching a different part of the elephant. And the person touching the trunk says, I know what the elephant is like. The elephant is dry and hard and scaly. Another person is touching the tail, the furry tail of the elephant. That person, no, you're wrong. The elephant is very soft, very furry. And then there's one person who can see. And he sees the whole elephant. And he says, you're all right. So stop fighting. That person is like the man sitting under the tree who sees the chameleon in different colors. The person who can see the whole elephant is the Vijnana. Which means that Vijnani has a more comprehensive vision of God than these other sadhakas and even realize it. Thank you.
Hiranya, if you don't mind, let me just ask a follow-up question. This is Anand from Pune. when you mention this, does it mean that in our life, I mean, forget about realization, but just hypothetically, to really be the Vijnani, one has to attain God, before which you cannot, by by implication, ever become a Vijnani. Is that what spiritual experience would be about? Because you always be following a path. You will not have the the benefit like or the tapasya like Ramakrishna had of realizing God from every path. So when we are unable to realize God from one path by itself, expecting that we'll have the experience of Vijnana is is not possible for us. Is that a correct statement?
This is another very tricky question, actually. So the question is, can everybody attain the state of Vijnana? And there are different answers depending on how you interpret Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. But from what I gather, right, if you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, what you'll find is that usually Sri Ramakrishna says that only a certain class of jiva, which is called Ishvara Kotis, Ishwakoti in Bengali, and he defines the Ishvara Koti as avatars, incarnations of God, and amshas of avatars, portions of an avatar, those who accompany an avatar. Only Ishvara Kotis can attain the state of Vijnana. He seems to say this in many places. In other places, some of his household disciples would become frightened, like your question. In one place in the Gospel, Ramchandra Datta, the doctor, who was a cousin of Swami Vivekananda, he asked Sri Ramakrishna, well, you're talking about Vijnana, but of course we householders can never attain that. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, it's not that. By God's grace, anybody can attain Vijnana. He also says that. So I think Sri Ramakrishna's position is that generally only Ishvara Kotis can attain Vijnana, but by God's grace, even ordinary souls can attain Vijnana as well. But the more practical aspect of your question is, if Vijnana is such a rarefied spiritual state of realization, which most of us can never attain, why should we bother about it, right? This is the question. But the thing is, what Sri Ramakrishna would say is, remember, he would say, in order to know what the Ganga is like, you don't have to swim the whole length of the Ganga. You just have to take a dip somewhere. Just put your one toe in one place of the Ganga, that means I've touched the Ganga. You don't have to go starting from the Himalayas, Gangotri, and then all the way down to where the Ganga ends. That's not the way. In the same way, you don't have to be a Vijnani to attain the highest goal of life. Remember that the goal of life, Sri Ramakrishna never said that all the different religious paths lead to Vijnana. He never said that, because that would be very narrow and that would be very restrictive. Because Vijnana is a very special type of spiritual experience. He said that every religious path will lead to God realization. And God realization is not the same thing as Vijnana. It can take many different forms. For Advaitins, God realization means you're realizing your identity with Nirguna Brahman. For a Christian, it means attaining the Christian heaven. For Muslims, it's attaining the Islamic heaven with Allah, etc., etc. So that salvation takes different forms. And there's a certain special class of soul which can attain Vijnana, but Vijnana is not necessary for salvation. That's the important thing. And as sadhakas, the other thing to keep in mind is, we can, even if we can't attain the state of Vijnana, even if it's very difficult or unrealistic, we can still learn from the Vijnani's worldview, from the way that the Vijnani sees the world. And we can try to simulate the state of Vijnana in our own lives as sadhakas, as spiritual aspirants. So what does the Vijnani do? The Vijnani accepts the reality of both the personal God and the impersonal God and tries to harmonize the different spiritual practices, the different yogas in our day-to-day lives. So each one of us can be a Vijnani in practice, even if we don't get the highest realization of Vijnana. Through the practice of a kind of simulated Vijnana, we can attain the goal of God realization.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Hiranya, please.
Yeah. Sorry, Maharaj, about that. I am now speaking from a different instrument. Maharaj, this is not a question, but endorsement from you. I can say that I am going back to that example of chameleon, and the question is that endorsement is to some extent related to some extent what Anand asked, Shirish asked, that chameleon's colors, green, orange, and the no color, they are all real. No imagination, no maya, nothing. They're all real. Chameleon can take many colors. So when we tell that Nirguna Brahmo and Saguna Brahmo, that Saguna Brahmo, like Kali, like Durga, like Krishna, did Ramakrishna mean that they are not imagination, they are real? And that is my question. Like chameleon's color, they are not imagination, they are real. So can I therefore take it granted, which I love to take it granted, but that they are real, they are not imagination, that's Sagun Brahma. And that is my question, not question or endorsement from you. And then my another second point is that
Let me first answer that,
okay.
then you can answer the next one. It'll be better. So yes, my answer is yes. It is exactly right. Is that not just the chameleon example, but there are many teachings where it's very clear that Saguna Brahman is 100% real. All the different forms of the personal God. One of the ways that he explains this is he says that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, like Agni and its Dahika Shakti, like fire and fire's power to burn. And then he says, you cannot think of fire without thinking of fire's power to burn. And you cannot think of fire's power to burn without thinking of fire. In the same way, Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, which means this is unlike traditional Advaita Vedanta. According to Advaita Vedanta, they use a rope and a snake. And that Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, is the rope. And the snake is the personal God, which is superimposed on the snake out of our own ignorance. The moment we attain knowledge of Brahman, the snake disappears and what's left is the rope, which means that the snake, the illusory snake, according to Advaita Vedanta, depends for its existence on the rope, which is the real reality. But the reality of the rope does not depend on the snake. Even if you don't see the illusory snake, the rope is still there. That's not Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. Sri Ramakrishna says both Nirguna Brahman and Shakti, the personal God, are equally real and equally inseparable from each other. And there are many other places where he says the same thing. In another place, he gives a beautiful example of an infinite ocean, which he says is like the ultimate reality, the divine reality. Then he says, in certain places, that ocean forms into different formations of ice. And those different forms of ice correspond to different forms of the personal God. Then he says, with the dawning of the sun of knowledge, Jnana Surya, those forms of ice melt. This is from the standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. And if he stopped there, we might think, okay, then he's an Advaita Vedanta and he's putting Nirguna Brahman on a higher level than the personal God. But he then says, but in some places the ice does not melt. And then he says, in some places the ice becomes quartz, Quartz. It becomes a permanent, eternal form. And he says, he calls this in Bangla, he says, Nitya Shakara. In Sanskrit it would be Nitya Sakara. So God, there is also a Nitya Sakara. There are also eternal forms of the personal God, which are worshipped by bhaktas. Like whether it's Vishnu or Allah or Christ or Krishna, all of these are eternal forms. So that when after we attain God realization in this body and we leave our body, the goal is we can dwell eternally in a loving communion with the personal God in his eternal form as Vishnu or Christ or Allah. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, the personal God is 100% real. It's no less real than Nirguna Brahman. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. The second one is just a simple thing. Maharaj, if I remember correctly, when Shankaracharya was doing his tapasya in Omkareshwar, he also used to pray to Jyotirlinga Shiv. But then, is he also did he accept that this Saguna Brahma existence? Am I right or am I wrong?
Okay, so it's another good question. The thing is, Indians have a tendency to, whenever a great saint comes, afterward what happens is, they tend to say that that great saint is responsible for 100 works. So Vyasa, Patanjali, Shankaracharya, they say Shankara was the composer of so many things, Bhaja Govindam, this text, that text, 100 things. What we know for sure, this is something that my Acharya in Training Center, who is a great scholar of Shankaracharya actually, he's Swami Jushtanandaji, he's now left his body a few years ago. He translated Shankara's Sanskrit commentaries on the scriptures into Bangla. And he told us, what we know for sure is that Shankaracharya composed the Prasthana Traya Bhashya. He composed Sanskrit commentaries on the Upanishad, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. So the most reliable text, source text to understand Sri Ramakrishna, Shankara's teachings are his commentaries on the scriptures. Whereas what you're talking about is more of this biographical information. We have no way to know whether that actually happened. We have absolutely no way. Can you prove that he did all this? No. What we do is we rely on these biographies, called, especially Shankara Digvijaya, which was composed many centuries after Shankara left his body. And we don't know how accurate those are. the best way to understand Shankaracharya's teachings is to study his Sanskrit commentaries on the scriptures. And my point is, if you study those commentaries, we're going to find, I think, if you try to honestly interpret what Shankara is saying, that he always puts Saguna Brahman on a lower footing. In fact, I was prepared to read one quotation. I thought it might be too technical, but since you're asking the question, I'll just read one quotation. This is from Shankaracharya's commentary on the Brahma Sutra 2.1.14. This is the English translation. Shankaracharya says, thus Ishvara, so Ishvara is Saguna Brahman, personal God. Ishvara's rulership, Ishvaratva, omniscience, Sarvajñatva, and omnipotence, Sarvashaktitva, are dependent on the limiting adjuncts conjured up by ignorance, upadhis. But from the ultimate standpoint, from the Paramatika standpoint, such terms as the ruler, the ruled, omniscience, etc., all the attributes of the personal God, cannot be used with regard to the Atman, the ultimate reality, Nirguna Brahman, shining in its own nature after the removal of all limiting adjuncts through knowledge. This is a bit technical, but the idea is, Shankaracharya says, the personal God is only real so long as we have not realized the highest truth of Nirguna Brahman. The moment we attain the knowledge of Brahman, there is no longer any personal God, there is only Nirguna Brahman, and we are that Brahman. So this is clear evidence from Shankara's commentaries that he did not accept the ultimate reality of Shakti, of the personal God. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you, Maharaj. We have time for only one last question. Please try to be brief. Introduce yourself. So if any person is there to ask the last question, welcome.
Yeah, Nimal, I'm Manoj. Can I ask a question, please?
Sure. Dr. Manoj Bhattacharya.
Pranam Swamiji, I'm Manoj Bhattacharya from Delhi. You have mentioned about inactive Brahman, so also active Brahman. So if we want to perceive inactive Brahman, do we have to imagine that as a counterfactual to active Brahman, or there is any example, that illustration which will help us to have some glimpses of realization of what inactive Brahman is?
See, it's not about perceiving inactive. Inactive Brahman means Nirguna Brahman. Nishkriya is the Bangla, near Bengali, Bhattacharya. So you say, Jokhan tani Nishkriya, tokhan amai Brahma bola kar. The inactive Brahman means the static, non-dual Brahman. You don't perceive that Brahman, you are that Brahman. So we can distinguish knowledge by knowledge of an object from knowledge by identity. This is knowledge by identity. In the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, we become one with Brahman. The way that Sri Ramakrishna explained this state of Advaitic realization is, he said a salt doll, a doll made of salt, went to measure the depths of the ocean. But the moment it set foot in the ocean, it melted in the ocean. This is the state of Advaita, of Advaitic realization. We become that Brahman. There's no question of perceiving Brahman, but we are that Brahman. That's the idea.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maharajji. What a beautiful discourse, especially perceiving Ramakrishna as the prophet of harmony through different Vedanta schools, harmonization through different religious practices, Gyan Yoga, Raj Yoga, etc., Karma Yoga, and the third, harmonization of world religions, and the beautiful example how Sri Ramakrishna himself practiced Islam and Christianity. It will be very, very relevant to our Filipino population here, the local population. They would be able to relate it very much, and the book by Sharud also refers to that. So thank you so much, Maharajji. And I just wanted to mention for the knowledge of the members joining the group that next week we have a related lecture by Narasimhanand ji of Kozhikode Ashram of Kerala in India, where he will speak on practical Vedanta. So you may like to relate what Swamiji told today, different practices, and in light of that, you can think about practical Vedanta. And thank you very much, Maharaji. Now I would request our friend Hiranya Mukhopadhyay to give vote of thanks. Thank you.
Maharaj, what can I say? Thank you on behalf of the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of Philippines from the bottom of our heart. It was a wonderful lecture. I like most your first part, that harmonization of different schools of Vedantic school. Really something new I learned, and wonderful lecture, and we hope we'll listen to your beautiful lecture again. But thank you again, Maharaj, for giving us this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Thank you very much, Maharaji. We would seek your blessings and would also seek your support. We would maybe people have would like to come back to you, sort of to ask something more. So we would like to invite you once again so that we have a fuller appreciation of these areas. So thank you very much, Maharaji. And we will now reassemble for another 5 minutes or so. If people have some exchange of ideas with you, they can take that opportunity. So please give me 30 seconds to stop recording, and then I'll come back where you can meet Maharaji once again.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent questions also.